Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the very first video of Birthright Fantasy. In this video, I want to give you an overview and a history of Dungeons & Dragons. And to start off, simply put, Dungeons & Dragons, also abbreviated as D&D, is the very first modern role-playing game. And the reason I have to say modern is because apparently some people in the Han Dynasty over there in China, way back a long time ago, they sat around and they role-played being younger, and they started it apparently. But other than that, in the modern time, this was the very first role-playing game, and it started off the trend. And now you see World of Warcraft and a lot of other games coming after, but Dungeons and Dragons was the first one to start this off. And I guess the next thing we need to look at is, what is a role-playing game? Well, a role-playing game is when you pretend to be someone that you're not. Essentially, that's it. Now, I know a lot of weird connotations are out there with the word role-playing. You might think of a bunch of nerds dressed up in Star Trek stuff playing Star Trek, or you might think of some weird stuff going on, in the bedroom with the whole role-playing thing. But this really has nothing to do with any of that. And the cool thing about Dungeons and Dragons is it's all in your imagination. So nothing's for real. There's no consequences. You're able to escape and go to an imaginary setting and have fun and make choices and make characters and complete missions. But it's all imaginary. You don't need to dress up. You don't need to do anything. You don't need any props. It's nothing like that. It's just all in your imagination. And that's what makes it an interesting game that you could play. All you need is dice. That's all you need, dice and some friends, and you could have a great time in a completely fantasy universe. And there's a lot of ways and a lot of games to give you the architecture to get to that fantasy universe, but I think Dungeons & Dragons is the best one. And I'm going to explain to you a little bit about the game of Dungeons & Dragons. Well, the first thing you got to learn about it is it's very varied. And by that I mean, some people play it kind of like a video game and they want everything to be exact and concrete, which kind of goes away from the role-playing aspect of it. You kind of get more competitive, you get more rigid system, but you get farther away from doing what you want and the role-playing aspect of it. For example, let's look at a movie and a book series that I hope you guys are familiar with, called Lord of the Rings. And this is an interesting book and movie series because it actually laid the foundation for a lot of the fantasy elements that Dungeons & Dragons used to create the game out of. But anyways, what I want to do is introduce three characters and kind of go through a role-playing scenario with them to kind of give you a feel of the rules of Dungeons & Dragons and how it works. So let's say you have Boromir, which is a human, sword and shield, that's how he fought. You have Legolas, and you have Gimli. Oh, sorry, Legolas is an elf. He fought with a bow and arrow. Tall, slender elf. And you have Gimli, a short, fat dwarf with an axe. You have these three characters in the woods, and they're walking along. We're role-playing, so there's three characters, three other people, and I'm running the game. So we have Gimli, Legolas, and Boromir. Well, running the game, I decide they're going to get ambushed by orcs. And one of them's going to shoot an arrow to start off the fight. He shoots an arrow, and I say he hits Boromir in the neck. Boromir, you're bleeding out. You're on the floor. You got about 2 minutes to live. It's not looking good. Well, the person playing Boromir might not be so happy at this point because he had no chance. I just decided he's going to die. So right now it's not really a game per se. I'm more telling a story, and we're just 100% on the role-playing side. Because he had no chance to dodge the arrow. He had no chance to walk sneakily. I just decided that he was going to get ambushed, and unfortunately he was the one who died. Now let's say after that happened, Boromir's bleeding out on the floor, and the other two players say, you know what, I want to climb a tree. So Legolas, tall, skinny, fast elf, climbs right up the tree, and then Gimli says, I want to climb the tree too. Well, how are you going to do that if you're short, fat, you have a bunch of armor on? It doesn't make much sense. So if Gimli climbs a tree up with Legolas, what kind of realism do we have? It's not that realistic. People are doing whatever they want in the role-playing scenario. But it's not making sense. So, in things like Dungeons & Dragons, you would have rules that would say, hey, if you're an elf and you're slender, you might have an easier time climbing that tree as opposed to the short, fat dwarf. You know what? You might not be able to climb so high, or you might slip and fall. And the big difference, well, it's almost like a spectrum between Dungeons & Dragons players is what side of the spectrum they're on. Are they on the role-playing side, where they kind of want to let anything go and just have fun with it and roll with the punches? Or on the opposite side of the spectrum, where they want all the rules to be concrete, kind of like a video game, where they have a competitive sense and things are the same every single time. So, anyways, that's a little bit about the role-playing aspect of it and what kind of game it is. So, the very first thing they made for Dungeons & Dragons was a game called Chainmail. And if you look at that right here, you can see a Crusader on there. Oh, fingers on it. You see his name? This is one of the people who made Dungeons & Dragons. His name is Gary Gygax. Not even sure how to pronounce that name. I'm never sure if I've heard it said, just seen it written. But anyways, this was the very first literature for Dungeons & Dragons, and it was made in 1978. So that's quite a while ago. And what happened was they decided, instead of wargaming, instead of having a bunch of miniatures and battlefields, they changed the game. So instead of commanding an army from a overhead perspective, they changed it to playing as one person from a first-person point of view. And that was an important thing. Then after that, they built on the real Dungeons & Dragons game. And right here, you will see authentic, original book from the very first original Dungeons & Dragons, supplement number 3, Eldritch Wizardry. And on that cover, what you can see is a female lying down on a sacrificial altar. And this was made in 1979. So 1 year after Chainmail, they came out with this. And as you might guess, back in 1979, times were a little bit more conservative, and they had a problem. Some people, a lot of people, had a problem with this kind of material being on games, which by chance were also catered towards children. And actually, one funny story, one kind of little caveat I'll go into is there was a private investigator, and he was hired to investigate the disappearance of a college-age male. And he went in, he discovered a little bit about the guy. It turns out he played Dungeons & Dragons. And he decided that was the reason he went missing. He was kind of going into the whole role-playing for weirdo thing, and he wanted to tell a story about how they were doing witchcraft and doing sacrifices down in the basement and all this crazy stuff. And he was sure it was Dungeons & Dragons, so he got all his buddies together who were playing. He questioned them all, and they showed him the places they played. And you know what? The guy got stressed out, and he moved out of state. That's all that happened. He wasn't part of any cult. He just played Dungeons & Dragons, and at one point he decided he wanted to move from his state and run away from things. And he showed up a couple months later. But the damage that guy did was a lot. And he made it hit national news. Dungeons & Dragons, is it the occult? Are people worshiping the devil? And nowadays, a lot of these stigmas, a lot of these associations are all but gone. I think people remember them in the past, and they know that it's kind of a nerdy, occultish thing to do. But nowadays, I don't think anyone generally believes that people are worshiping the devil or being a part of the cult or doing anything crazy like that. So that's a good thing. You don't got to get wrapped up in that if you start playing. So a little bit after the original edition, which is kind of like an edition 0, because this is what most players commonly refer to as the first edition, Dungeons & Dragons. And they went from the small printed out pamphlets to more of a hardback series cover of books. And I don't want to go too much into the books and for this intro video, but I'll just show you what they did. You see the artwork is pretty basic on this, because a lot of these artworks, they were drawn for the very first time, and people didn't quite know what they were drawing, because back in Lord of the Rings, you got to think, at this time the movies weren't even out, and it was just a book. So all you had to go on some of these monsters was a written description, and no one had drawn them out. So monsters you might see from Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings or Star Wars or whatever you might watch, the hippogriff, the griffin, dragons even. You know, a lot of the stuff hadn't been drawn out, and they took it upon themselves to draw it out. So in the first edition, you see a lot of old artwork. A lot of kids actually were doing artwork in these books. But then you move on from the first edition, and you have the second edition. And the second edition kind of took it in a more broad sense and introduced a lot of new environments. And for example, this book right here, called The Complete Spacefarer's Handbook, introduced the ability to not even fly ships in the ocean, but to sail them in space. So second edition, they started getting a lot of money, and they really expanded a lot of stuff. And with second edition, they introduced a lot of settings and a lot of new ways to play the game, which I'll go into further with other videos, but I don't want to get too much in the detail here. But then you have the edition that I started off on when I was young, third edition right here. This book itself is all about dragons. One of my favorite books. There we go. Beautiful book, completely illustrated with dragons. Actually, the same dragons you see behind me here. Let's see if I get out of the way. You have red dragon, green dragon, black dragon, copper dragon, white dragon, blue dragon, bronze, brass, gold, silver. Those are the 10 basic dragons. The ones with colors are evil, and the ones with metallic names, those are the good dragons. Anyways, I figure I might tell you a little bit about that because we're going over Dungeons and Dragons. But the next edition to come out, 4th edition, I'm not even going to show you anything about that. It was really a garbage tier edition. Really not that much going on with it. And currently we have 5th edition, which is interesting because it has attracted an astronomical amount of players, new players looking at the game, looking at 5th edition. And part of that is because it's had a lot of mainstream success, partially due to, I've never seen this show, but Stranger Things, some of you might watch it or have seen it, brought a lot of attention to the game. I tried watching it, and the very first scene had those like 12-year-old boys standing around the table yelling curse words and screaming, and I shut it off in the first 5 minutes. I couldn't do it. But here I am holding a product from there because it's Dungeons and Dragons, and I'm about everything Dungeons and Dragons. So anyways, that's a little bit of the history of the editions, and a little bit about the history of Dungeons and Dragons in general, and what it means to play a role-playing game. I hope you enjoyed the video and learned a lot, and you have a great day.